My name is Father Joe Hilinski. I'm the chaplain of the Serra Clubs of Cleveland. And in these sets of videos, I'm going to be covering the life and the work of our patron saint, Saint Junipero Serra, a man of great importance for the history of our country, as well as great importance in the life of the saints of the Catholic Church. Junipero Serra comes from a place called Mallorca. Some of you may have heard of it because it really has a great popularity and reputation as being a vacation spot for many people from Northern Europe. It is located on the east side of the east coast, I should say, of Spain. It has its own name, Mallorca. It has its own tradition. It's an interesting place. It's part of what's called the Balearic Islands, and it sits in the beautiful Mediterranean. Having had a chance to visit there, I was quite intrigued and taken up with the beauty of this very beautiful island. And it really hit me the first time I saw Mallorca, is why would anybody leave Mallorca to travel? It's almost some 6,000 miles to Mexico to begin his missionary work. But that's sort of the mystery of his life. Mallorca, in a sense, is a very mysterious island, too, in some ways. It was under Moorish influence. There was actually a Moorish emirate was in charge and controlled this island for a number of centuries. And it wasn't until James I of Aragon that he entered the island and took possession of it and made it a Christian possession under his empire, James I of Aragon. There are a lot of different influences in this wonderful island of Mallorca. Before the Moorish Muslim presence, there was the Roman presence. You have to remember, all these islands in the Mediterranean, if they had some kind of water or some kind of harbor, were used by the Romans as stopping places along the Mediterranean. And so there's Roman influence, there is Moorish influence, and of course then there is the Christian influence that comes from the Spanish background. It's very interesting that the Mallorcans referred to Spain as the peninsula. And in a very real way, the Spaniards consider the people that live on this island a particular name, Mallorcan. It's very important even to realize that linguistically there's a little difference between Spanish and Mallorcan, and that all goes into a place called Catalan. The northern part of Spain is Catalonian, and it does not speak Castilian, it speaks Catalonian. And even the Mallorcan dialect is a little bit of a variant on this Catalan dialect that you find in Spain. But it's very important to keep in mind that this very exotic island has some very interesting differences. Someone culturally described it this way, and they used dance as a way of understanding the difference of mentality between the Mallorcans and the Spaniards. In Spain, you have the flamenco dance, which is a dance with a very rhythmic staccato, and it has its own beat. If you've ever seen the flamenco dance, very intense, very strong beat to it. But in Mallorca, you have a more you might say, call it a lilting singing, and circles of dancers in the squares of the towns and villages of Mallorca. They use sea chanties and lines. It's a much more smooth, much more reflective, even in a very sense, much more communal gathering of people together that they use in their dance. So even a little bit of a dance there is important in understanding the difference between the Mallorcans and the peninsulars, or the peninsula of Spain. He was born in a town called Petra. Again, it's more like a village. I mean, you can hardly believe how small it is. Seems like a little cluster of houses and a few churches in the middle of almost nowhere on this island. And it was in Petra that he was born on the 24th of November in 1713. Now, he was baptized Miguel Jose. Interesting. Miguel Jose Serra. The name Junipero would be taken later in life when he became a Franciscan. But he was really Miguel. He was the oldest son of a farmer and his wife. He only had another sister, and he was, interestingly enough, baptized almost immediately on the day he was born. And interestingly, he was baptized at 2 years old. You say 2 years old. You have to remember that in those days, sometimes bishops didn't travel very much. And when they did arrive at a town or a village, I mean, there was a whole assortment of people from the youngest to the oldest, since the last time the bishop was there, would be confirmed. It was not a planned out activity as we have here in the United States now, or especially in our dioceses in the United States. It was a whole different world. So he was baptized at 2. He grew up breeding cattle, planting and harvesting, dealing with hay, olives, and grape harvests as were on his father's farm. And his father was very proud of him because as the oldest son and the only son that he had, he looked forward to the day that he would hand over to Michael, his farm. But that was not to be what was going to happen, because Miguel went to a Franciscan friary for school, which is only a 5-minute walk away from his house, to learn a little bit of language, a little bit of reading, to get a little bit more of a background. At 15, he wanted to be a priest. And so the parents had to take him to Palma, the capital, where they had the theological schools, where he could be educated. And he went into what we call a diocesan situation, become a diocesan priest. But while there, he was taught by Franciscans. And he got very enamored with the Franciscan order. And as time would come along, by 1730, he decided he wanted to be a Franciscan. Received at that time was a gray habit that they wore, sandals and cord. His novitiate begins, and then he does make his profession as a Franciscan, and that is when he takes the name Junipero. Now, Junipero was one of the great companions, close companions of St. Francis of Assisi, and he wanted to exemplify Father Francis in his life. And so his father was very encouraging. It's very interesting. His father was very encouraging in this movement of him and his vocation, even though he lost his son, and he lost his son to take over his farm. It's interesting, his sister does finally take over the farm many years later with her husband. And it's interesting that from her marriage with her husband, there are a number of further vocations in the Serra family. A nephew becomes a Capuchin, and a great-nephew becomes a diocesan priest. So already, you might say, our patron for our vocation club exemplifies in his own family our prayers for vocations. So I leave you with that introduction to the life and the journey of Saint Junipero Serra. Miguel, as you now have found out, his first name was Miguel Jose when he was baptized. And we will further our discussion in another video, which goes on to some of his work as a Franciscan and how he gets to Mexico.